Okay, so this is going to be the study guide review for exam 2. So the first part is chapter 5. The family-based economy was just when the economic unit was the household. And so most of the production happened at home on small farms or plantations or haciendas or things like that. The family wage economy is when people moved outside the home through industrialization. So there were certain household tasks that were done before that were then automated so people could move outside of the home to work in industrial labor. So let's see. Oh, this one's basically what the answer is. Industrial economy has moved but not gone away. So like that video I made you guys watch about Bangladesh, it's this idea that, it might be gone from our sight, but it's not gone from society. A lot of the products that we use every day come from this still kind of brutal industrial economy that operates in other places around the world. So we talked about that race in the bottom, and I showed you that really depressing video about the parallel between the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire and what happened almost 100 years to the day later in Bangladesh. Okay, so let's see. Family consumer economy is, basically our modern economy now that's kind of a step above the family wage economy, where people just buy stuff, basically, where we don't produce things, we consume things. Okay, so the cult of true womanhood is that notion of separate spheres, right? That idea that the ideal woman was one who stayed in the home, who was virtuous, and a symbol of middle-class prosperity. Okay, significance of class. Just the idea that it's more than an economic relationship. It also involves power relationships and different access to resources and control to find a place in the social hierarchy. And when I say race matters, that just means that intersectional theory talks about how race is important to study, but it also overlaps with concepts like gender and class to form a system of advantage and disadvantage where some people have more privilege than others based on their social location. Women in the economic recession, just the idea that women tend to be contingent workers more so than men. So when economic problems hit, they are often the first ones to go because they aren't the kind of workers that have, the jobs that have security. Gender segregation is the pattern by which men and women are situated in different jobs throughout the workforce. Women in blue-collar work, just the idea that women are making progress, but in fields like construction, they're still only 2% of the workers. A lot of women's jobs involve service work, which involves emotional labor, which we've talked about. So meaning that they have to suppress their emotions or elicit certain emotions within the course of their job. So some of the examples we talked about in class is the idea that, like a waitress will often have to wear revealing clothing and deal with people's sexism as a result. Or, what Hochschild was originally studying, which was the job of flight attendants, where women had to perform femininity to put patrons at ease. So, those are some kind of examples of the kind of emotional labor that's involved in women's service work. The motherhood wage penalty refers to a pattern where women that work, or, mothers that work outside the home have lower incomes than women who work that don't have children. The dual labor market theory just argues that there's two different labor markets, the primary market and the secondary market. So the primary market has those good paying jobs. That's like why you're in college, because you want the jobs with the good working conditions and retirement and benefits and all that fun stuff. And the secondary labor market's more like what you're probably working in now, right? It's low pay jobs, high turnover, less job security, fewer benefits. So just the idea that there's those two. Sexual harassment, we talked about this a lot. What I wanted you to know for this is just that the general definition is unwanted sexual advances or the imposition of sexual requirements, in a relationship of unequal power between a boss and a subordinate. So there's different kinds. We talked about quid pro quo harassment, where someone offers something like, oh, if you do this, then I'll give you a promotion, or if you don't do this, I'm going to fire you, or something like that, where it's an exchange. Or there's also the situation of hostile work environments, which we talked about with the case of Anita Hill, right? Where women feel, powerless to do anything because they feel like if they complain, no one's going to take it seriously. So, but they just face this kind of hostile environment of sexual criticism. Okay, let's see. Homophobia, basically just the idea that in the book they talked about these surveys that were done on gay and lesbian employees, and they found that over half of all of them had faced some sort of harassment on the job because of their sexual orientation. What I want you to know about TANF is that, unlike the stereotype of the welfare queen that has a bunch of kids to get more benefits, women who have additional children on TANF do not receive any additional benefits. Let's see. Oh, well, we're talking about the second shift in the context of Chapter 5. They were talking about how the second shift is actually kind of a third shift because women, other than just taking care of working and their own families, they're often the ones who take care of their, extended family members or, friends or things like that. And I think I gave you the example of this coworker I have at the library that she's constantly, helping someone else. She's either at her church functions or, taking meals to these elderly couples down the street or, involved outside of work in some way or taking care of her husband. So her life is kind of that service work in a lot of ways. Okay, let's see. Chapter 7. What I want you to know about race, class, and health is that if you're a minority in the workforce, you're more likely to, have higher rates of illnesses or accidental deaths because of the kind of job segregation we have based on race. When it comes to race and eating disorders, most of the research that looked at eating disorders has really only focused on white, upper to middle class women, and only recently have they started kind of expanding that. When it comes to eating disorders, they're really just often a consequence of our cultural obsession with weight and thinness. When it comes to drinking, gender and alcohol, women tend to drink less than men, meaning men tend to behave in binge drinking behaviors, especially in college, which has a lot to do with the kind of peer group mentality. When it comes to women and smoking, if women start smoking, they are more likely than men to continue. Let's see, when it comes to HIV/AIDS, when the disease was originally discovered, they thought that it only affected gay men. So the public health response was very delayed. And it's often transmitted through unprotected sex and intravenous drug use. But how it affects women is the fact that it's the leading cause of death for women of reproductive age around the globe. So, in like sub-Saharan Africa, the cases are incredible. So, it is a thing that's affecting women globally. When it comes to disability, people that are disabled are seen as asexual, which kind of shows how our bodies are framed in very gendered ways. They're, and when it comes to women and disabilities, women are more likely to be or become disabled than men. Let's see, birth control. Oh, there's a study in the book talking about how teens that take birth control lower the teen pregnancy rate. But, they talked about how in some states you don't need parental approval to get birth control. And of the teens that do that get birth control without parental permission, 70% of them said if they had to ask their parents, they wouldn't do it. So it shows that, giving teens access without having their parents as a barrier means that more of them are going to engage in safe sex behaviors, but they just don't want to have that uncomfortable talk with their parents. When it comes to abortion, Roe v. Wade gave women the right to choose abortion, but in the book they talk about the 1989 Supreme Court case that gave states the option to restrict access, which has resulted in a lot of laws that require parental consent for abortions, result in the fact that 87% of all U.S. counties do not have an abortion provider. So as a result as well, lots of abortion providers experience some sort of harassment. So either they get picketed or vandalized. They often experience bomb threats, physical intimidation, and even the murder of doctors. Like I showed you that clip from, after Tiller about, someone that does late-term abortions. So, as much as that it is a right women have, the 1989 case gave the ability to put restrictions. Let's see, racism and reproduction. So while most women of color support access to contraceptives and abortion, historically, women's access to these contraceptives was linked to the eugenics movement, meaning that kind of racialized movement that said that white people were superior and other races had to be controlled in their population, which is actually why, a lot of women of color were sterilized. Let's see, politics of birth. So the idea that, according to, I had you guys watch that clip of the business of being born, the fact that, it used to be that childbirth was something that was largely done by women, as in like the person delivering the child was typically a midwife, and that nowadays women don't feel comfortable having a baby at home because we've kind of medicalized the process. And so very few women in this country use midwives at all, even within hospitals, though it's very common in other cultures. Let's see. Okay, so politics of birth. Oh no, I just did that. Okay, so when it comes to advertising, that one's kind of the answer. Advertising constructs a very specific image of beauty for women in our culture, meaning that it promotes this impossibly thin body type that is not natural, right? But it's a Photoshop thing, that they value whiteness and even cut women into parts, like decompartmentalize them instead of seeing them as whole people. Let's see, language reflects the dominant culture. And we talked about how they use the term Miss or Mrs. before the term Ms. was created to kind of determine a woman's status, or the fact that most women still take their husband's last name, or we commonly refer to women with animal names, right? Like chicks, foxes, all that kind of stuff. So it just kind of shows how language reflects the values of the dominant culture of patriarchy. So the body culture is a way that social definitions of gender link masculinity with power, strength, and dominance, while women are cut down to size. Portrayals of aging often show very few older women, and when they are shown on television or through media, they're largely stereotyped. They show, women as, trying to hold on to their beauty through all of these kind of products like creams and such. But it doesn't really portray men in the same way. Men are often still portrayed as attractive or sexy, even if they have gray hair, unlike women. When it comes to sports, women's sports are not aired as much as male sports, even though women compete in a lot of sports at comparable rates as men. We still prioritize men's sports as the real sports and women's sports as something less than. Let's see, what's the next one? Oh, controlling images are the power of the media and pop culture to kind of control our concepts of ourselves and others by putting out these specific images that kind of give us certain meanings of what it is to be a man or a woman. Cultural narratives are the frameworks we use to understand the world. Oh, and really how we understand ourselves. So, these frameworks will often have certain class or gender or race or any of those kind of undertones that portray certain people in certain stereotypical roles. So when it comes to our cultural narratives, it tends to be racialized. The debate around violence in the media shows that, some people have argued for a long time that there's a relationship between violence in pornography and violence against women in the larger culture, where it's not as if it's a direct correlation. It's just this idea that it could normalize aggression and violence towards women in a sexualized way. Role learning theory suggests that images in the media become the models for how we construct our self-concepts, and how we understand our cultural ideals come through these kind of images that we absorb over and over and over through the media. Capitalism just means this idea that what the advertisers want to sell you has to be linked to the actual programming that they show you otherwise, so that there's this relationship where, the interests of the sponsors are to have, everyone look a certain way so that they can kind of keep people anxious about who they are so that they'll buy a bunch of crap, right? Okay. Postmodernism believes that truth and knowledge are subjective. They argue that we have to deconstruct our social institutions to rebuild new ones that kind of reflect our modern situation. And when it comes to Mannheim, his knowledge and ideology stuff, he was basically just talking about the fact that, any ideology at a time typically involves some distortions of reality, but it does so in order to provide a justification for the status quo, or for, what we consider normative at that time period. Okay, so then for the short answer essays, for Killing Us Softly 4, what are some of the physical, emotional, and psychological effects on girls and women who try to live up to our cultural beauty ideals? So they go through that a lot in the film, like not just eating disorders, but all sorts of emotional and psychological effects. And what are some of the effects on men and their perceptions of women and themselves? So what I'm looking for there is that you answer both parts of that question, that, how does this affect men on their perceptions of women? Meaning that if they see these photoshopped, idealized versions of women so much all the time that they think that that's what beautiful is, it affects how they actually love and feel and treat the women in the real women, the non-photoshopped women, the actual women in their real lives. And how they view themselves in another way, like this idea that a lot of these images tell men that women are sexual objects there for their consumption. So a lot of men get that message that, they deserve women, that women are there for their consumption. And so that can really dramatically, set up a very unequal patriarchal belief system. Okay, so how does our economic system of capitalism affect the programming and advertising that we see in the media? How is the media an agent of social control? So this one, it kind of touches upon it at the end of this chapter. But what I'm looking for there is that, capitalism, because the entire media system relies upon the money from advertising, it's not as if it comes from like the public, like a PBS kind of situation where it's public funded. So, they can often talk about things or report on things others can't. Because basically, if you want to sell advertising to make your program successful, then you have to make sure that you're not going to say or do anything or show anything that's going to offend those advertisers. So, the advertisers then have a big stake, have a big controlling interest in how portrayals are shown, in what kind of images are seen in the culture, right? Because they want you to see certain things so that you kind of see a certain kind of normalcy. Like the idea that when we watch television, the majority of the stories come from a very affluent or upper middle class lifestyle, which again benefits advertisers that are then going to try and sell you all of that crap, right? So that you can be living in the same social class status as them. So that's kind of an example of that. So, and how is the media an agent of social control? Well, it's a very strong socializer, right? So it has the power to really normalize any sort of status quo that we have by saying, by kind of effectively shutting out people that are different, or, only privileging and showing one group of people. We kind of normalize that that's who is important, that's whose stories need to be told, that's how society should be, what we should aspire to, which again affects our own internalized selves. It affects our identities, and it affects whether, what we strive to do with our lives or who we want to be. So the media can challenge this. It can be a force for challenging or disruption, but often it is a way that it maintains the kind of status quo or social control, because it's able to kind of blast thousands upon thousands of these kind of controlled images at us with a certain cultural narrative, that push us a certain way. So anyway, that's all I'm looking for those, is just to answer both parts of questions and all that fun stuff. Hopefully this helps you guys out, because you seemed to appreciate it last time, so hopefully you like this one as well.